Lydia Moore had never been the sort of person who drew unnecessary attention to herself, and after years of living in a crowded apartment above a noisy cafe in Portland, she had moved to the quiet edges of a small coastal town to find the kind of calm she thought she would never have. Her new home sat at the end of a long, gently sloping asphalt driveway that wound down from the main road like a ribbon of dark glass, bordered on both sides by tall spruce trees and a scattering of wildflowers that thrived in the salty air. The driveway was her favorite feature of the property, not because it was particularly grand or impressive to anyone else, but because it gave her a sense of privacy. She could work in her garage workshop restoring antique furniture without the sound of passing traffic or the sight of curious strangers peering in. For Lydia, this was the life she had envisioned. Quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons spent sanding down a century-old oak dresser, evenings with the scent of the ocean drifting in from the bay. It was just after sunrise on a Tuesday when she stepped out onto her porch, cradling a warm mug between her hands and enjoying the damp coolness of the morning air. The sky was streaked with pale orange, and for a few seconds she simply stood there, breathing in the smell of wet earth. Then her eyes moved toward the driveway, and for a moment she thought she was looking at some strange reflection of the sky itself. Thousands of tiny, multicolored glints catching the light and winking back at her in an almost hypnotic shimmer. She walked forward slowly, the cool boards of the porch pressing against her bare feet, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. As she came closer, her steps grew cautious. The entire stretch of asphalt, from the bend near the road all the way up to her garage doors, was carpeted in small glass marbles, so many of them that the dark pavement was barely visible beneath the shifting rainbow of their surfaces. For a few seconds she could only stand there, baffled, the steam from her coffee curling into the air as her mind tried to wrap around the absurdity of it. Marbles? Thousands of them? It looked like something out of a surreal art installation, except there was nothing whimsical about the way they rolled underfoot when she took a tentative step forward. The surface was treacherous. Her sandal slipped, and she had to steady herself against the porch railing to avoid falling. A sharp bark drew her eyes toward the side yard, where her golden retriever, Milo, was pacing along the grass, whining in confusion. He had ventured close to the edge of the driveway, but now he held one paw up awkwardly, as though something had cut or bruised it. Lydia's stomach tightened with worry, and she quickly set down her mug and crouched beside him, running her hands gently over the paw. Sure enough, there was a small nick near the pad, and when she looked closer at the marbles, she realized some were chipped or cracked, leaving jagged edges that could easily injure a paw, or a bare foot. Her first thought was that it had to be some kind of childish prank, maybe local kids with too much time on their hands, though she couldn't imagine how they could have transported this many marbles without being noticed. But then, as she glanced toward the bend in the driveway, she saw movement. A woman standing just beyond the line of trees, one hand resting on the handle of a large plastic storage bin, the other holding up a phone as if she were filming. Lydia recognized her instantly. Karen Holt, her neighbor from 3 houses down, a woman she had met exactly twice since moving here, and who had managed, in those 2 brief encounters, to leave Lydia with the impression of someone who smiled too widely while speaking in a tone that carried an unspoken challenge. Now Karen was smirking openly, and when she noticed Lydia looking, she raised her voice over the morning stillness. "Pest Deterrence," she called, as though that explained everything, her tone laced with a mock friendliness that made Lydia's skin prickle. Lydia didn't respond right away. She was still trying to make sense of the scene, still wondering how it could possibly be legal for someone to dump this kind of hazard across her private drive. Karen, apparently taking Lydia's silence as an invitation to continue, added, "You'll thank me later. Keeps the snakes away." She gave a little wave before stepping out of sight, the crunch of her shoes on gravel fading toward the road. The absurdity of the moment clashed with the creeping unease that settled in Lydia's chest. She had moved here to escape the constant friction of city living, but as she looked down at the glass-strewn driveway, at Milo limping cautiously toward the porch, she had the sinking feeling that peace was about to become a lot harder to hold on to than she had imagined. Lydia spent the rest of that morning in a state of unsettled distraction. The coffee she had set on the porch now cold and untouched, her workshop left unopened for the first time in weeks. The sight of the marbles still spread like a treacherous, shimmering carpet across her driveway had lodged itself in her mind, and no matter how she tried to rationalize it, nothing about the situation felt benign. The logical side of her argued that this could simply be a bizarre, overzealous attempt by a neighbor to help, however misguided it might be. But the other side of her, the one that had learned to trust instincts sharpened over years of living in places where keeping your head down meant keeping yourself safe, whispered that this was a warning dressed up as neighborly advice. She kept replaying Karen Holt's smirk in her head, the way her tone had teetered between amusement and condescension, as if she were performing for some invisible audience only she could see. By late morning, Lydia decided she couldn't just leave the mess where it was. The marbles were not only an injury risk for Milo but also a hazard to her own footing, and she didn't want to discover what might happen if she tried to back her car down the slope. She fetched an old push broom from the garage and began sweeping in slow, deliberate strokes, trying to corral the rolling glass into piles that she could then scoop into heavy-duty trash bags. The work was slow, frustrating, and physically exhausting. The marbles refused to stay in place, and every time she thought she had gathered a substantial pile, one misplaced step would send dozens scattering like quicksilver over the asphalt. She was halfway through when a vehicle pulled up near the bend in her driveway, a white delivery van idling with its hazard lights on. At first, she thought it might be another neighbor stopping to offer unsolicited commentary, but the driver, a young man in a company uniform, got out holding a medium-sized cardboard box. "Delivery for Moore," he called, glancing at a clipboard before frowning at the sheet attached to it. Lydia Moore?" She nodded and wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, only for him to hesitate. "Funny thing, this one's addressed to this address, but the name on it says Patrick Granger. That you?" Lydia shook her head, confused. She had never heard the name before. The driver seemed uncertain, his eyes flicking toward the driveway littered with marbles. "Well, it's got this address, so I can't just take it back without some sort of refusal form." He pulled a phone from his pocket and dialed, speaking in a low tone to someone on the other end. Lydia, unable to help herself, caught snippets of his words. "She's here." "Yeah, she doesn't know the name." "No, didn't sign anything yet." The hairs on the back of her neck rose. After a moment, he hung up and said that his dispatcher told him to mark it as refused and that someone else would handle the delivery. He placed the box back in the van and drove off without another word, leaving Lydia with a lingering unease. There was nothing inherently sinister about a misdelivered package, but the combination of the marbles, Karen's strange justification, and now an unexplained delivery addressed to her home felt too tightly packed together to dismiss as coincidence. She carried on sweeping, her mind racing, considering whether she should call someone in authority about the marbles. But who would she even call? It wasn't exactly a police matter unless she could prove malicious intent, and the idea of walking into the local station and explaining that her neighbor had dumped marbles on her driveway to deter pests sounded absurd enough to invite polite dismissal. Still, the thought of doing nothing gnawed at her. By early afternoon, she had bagged the bulk of the marbles and set the heavy trash bags at the edge of her garage wall. Milo, still limping slightly, watched from a shady spot on the porch, his amber eyes tracking her movements as though he sensed her tension. Lydia decided to walk down toward the road to clear her head and see if Karen's house showed any sign of activity. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small noise, the creak of a tree limb, the distant call of a gull, stand out. When she reached the corner where Karen's driveway met the main road, she saw that her neighbor's garage door was open, and inside were 3 large plastic storage bins identical to the one she had seen Karen holding earlier that morning. 2 of them had their lids ajar, and she could see the glittering spheres piled inside. There were enough marbles in those bins to repeat the stunt on her driveway 10 times over. Karen herself was nowhere to be seen, but Lydia heard the faint hum of a television from inside the house. She debated for a moment whether to walk up and knock, to demand some kind of explanation or at least a promise that it wouldn't happen again. But something in her told her that confronting Karen directly, especially without witnesses, would be a mistake. Instead, she walked back toward her own property, but not before noticing a detail she had missed earlier. Small white paint marks, no bigger than coins, dotted along the edge of her driveway where it met the road. They were spaced evenly, almost measured, and they hadn't been there the day before. It was the sort of marking she had seen when road crews prepared for maintenance or when utility companies planned to dig. The realization made her stop in her tracks. The marbles could have been a bizarre way to justify or camouflage an attempt to make her driveway unusable, forcing her to either abandon it or agree to some community alteration. She thought about the package addressed to Patrick Granger and wondered if that name might appear on some paperwork or permit she hadn't seen yet. The possibility that someone was trying to set the stage for claiming her driveway as theirs felt increasingly plausible, though she couldn't yet piece together the how or why. As the sun dipped lower, Lydia took Milo inside and locked the front. Dior, feeling the weight of a tension she couldn't quite name. She had moved here for solitude and the comfort of working with her hands, but now her private little road felt like a stage where something was unfolding just out of sight. Each odd detail. A neighbor's smirk, a mislabeled package, fresh paint. Marks. Another fragment of a larger picture she didn't yet understand. What she did know was that the driveway she had loved for its peace and privacy had, in the span of a day, become the center of something intrusive, deliberate, and possibly dangerous. She could either hope it ended there or start thinking about what to do when it didn't. And deep down, she already knew which choice she would have to make. The following morning brought with it a crisp, cloudless sky and the kind of stillness that might have been comforting under any other circumstances. But Lydia woke with an uneasy heaviness in her chest that the cool air did nothing to ease. She had fallen asleep later than usual, her mind spinning with possibilities about the marbles, the package, and the strange paint marks along her driveway. By the time she stepped outside, coffee in hand, the unease had crystallized into something sharper, a wariness, almost an expectation that she would find something amiss again. That expectation proved correct. The driveway she had spent hours clearing the day before was no longer the smooth, clean stretch of asphalt she had left behind. Overnight, someone had repeated the act with even greater precision, this time spreading not only thousands of marbles but mixing them with fine shards of glass that caught the sunlight in glittering, jagged flashes. Her first instinct was to scan the tree line, to see if anyone was watching from the shadows, but the woods were still, their silence almost oppressive. Milo, who had been eager to join her outside, stopped short at the edge of the porch and sniffed the air before letting out a low, uncertain whine. Lydia crouched beside him, stroking his head, and felt her own pulse quicken. The situation had crossed a threshold. It was no longer something she could even pretend was accidental or harmless. Someone had gone to significant effort in the dead of night to escalate the hazard, and that someone had done it with the confidence that they could act without being seen or stopped. She backed up into the house and retrieved her phone, taking a long series of photographs from multiple angles, making sure to capture not just the surface of the driveway but the paint marks, the tree line, and the point where the asphalt met the road. She was meticulous, telling herself it was for insurance purposes. But in truth, she wanted a record that couldn't be brushed off if this ever came before an authority. She also began a written account in a notebook, documenting times, dates, and descriptions of everything that had happened since the first morning. She knew from experience that memories could be contested or undermined, but written records carried weight that verbal claims did not. The question of who to contact first hung in the air like a loaded decision. Calling the police felt premature. She could imagine the polite but non-committal response, the suggestion that it was a civil matter, or even that she might be overreacting. Instead, she decided to reach out to the local road maintenance authority, reasoning that if any work was actually planned near her driveway, they would know about it and could confirm whether the paint markings were theirs. The woman who answered the phone was polite but firm. There were no scheduled works on Lydia's street, and no permits had been filed for any changes to her driveway. The information should have been reassuring, but instead it sharpened her concern. If those markings weren't from the road department, then someone else had placed them there for a purpose. As she ended the call, her phone buzzed with a message notification. The number was unfamiliar, and the text was short. You can't keep it blocked forever. There was no signature, no context beyond the implication that someone believed she was preventing access to something they wanted. Lydia stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen as she debated whether to respond or to save it for her growing file of evidence. She chose the latter, forwarding it to her email and printing a copy on the small printer she kept in her workshop. By mid-morning, she had resolved to remove the hazard again, but this time she would not simply sweep it to the side. She dragged out a large plastic tarp and heavy gloves, scooping both marbles and glass shards into it with a flat shovel. The sound was unpleasant, a grinding clink that set her teeth on edge. When the tarp was full, she dragged it up beside her garage where she could sort through it later. Her progress was slow, and as she worked, she heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. She turned to see Karen approaching from the direction of the road, dressed in a bright windbreaker and holding a reusable water bottle, as though she were simply out for a morning walk. "Looks like you had another visit," Karen said with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Shame. All that work you did yesterday. Some people just don't respect community measures." Lydia straightened, gripping the shovel handle. "Is that what you call this? Community measures?" Her voice was calm, but each word carried a weight she didn't bother to disguise. Karen tilted her head in mock innocence. "It's about safety. You think I like seeing snakes around here? We've got kids in the neighborhood, you know. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good." It took every ounce of restraint for Lydia not to demand outright whether Karen was responsible, but she suspected that the woman would deny it with a kind of smug deflection designed to make Lydia appear unreasonable. Instead, she simply said, "My driveway is private property. You have no right to put anything on it without my permission." Karen's smile flickered, just for a moment before she replied, "That's one interpretation. I'm sure we'll get it sorted out." Without waiting for a response, she turned and continued down the road, leaving Lydia standing in the cool morning air with a tightness in her chest that felt like the start of something much larger than a neighborly dispute. That afternoon, Lydia took the tarp full of marbles and glass to the local waste transfer station, explaining to the attendant that the material was unsafe to leave on her property. The man raised his eyebrows but didn't comment, merely directing her to a disposal area. On the drive back, she couldn't shake the feeling that the escalation had been intentional, a message that removing the hazard would only invite it back in greater volume. She thought about the text message again, the implied threat behind it, and realized that whoever was behind this believed she would eventually give up out of exhaustion or fear. By the time she turned into her driveway, she had decided on one thing with certainty. She would not be dealing with this alone anymore. Whether it meant involving law enforcement, seeking legal advice, or enlisting allies among her few trusted neighbors, she was going to ensure that the next move did not come as easily for whoever was orchestrating this. The clean stretch of asphalt in front of her looked almost fragile in its emptiness, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it was targeted again. The question now was how prepared she would be when it happened. 2 uneventful days passed after Lydia's last cleanup, days that might have allowed her to breathe more easily if not for the low, persistent hum of vigilance that had taken root in her mind. She had fallen into a rhythm of checking the driveway first thing in the morning and again before bed, scanning for any sign of interference as if she were a night guard patrolling a perimeter. She made a point to keep Milo indoors after dark and to close the blinds as soon as dusk fell, a habit she had never kept before. Still, the reprieve was welcome, and she let herself imagine that perhaps the escalation had reached its peak and would now fade into nothing more than an uncomfortable memory. That illusion shattered on the third night when she was startled awake by the faint but unmistakable sound of tires crunching slowly over gravel. Her first instinct was to check the clock, 2:14 a.m., and then to slip out of bed as quietly as possible, careful not to startle Milo, who was now alert and standing at the bedroom door. She moved to the window that overlooked the bend in the driveway, peering through a narrow gap between the blinds. The moonlight was enough to illuminate the outline of a box truck parked at the road's edge, its headlights off, its rear door open. Two figures moved in and out of the shadows, each carrying large sacks over their shoulders, and even from this distance, Lydia could see the faint, unmistakable glint of marbles spilling through the loose seams of the bags. Her stomach knotted, and she stepped back from the window, mind racing through her options. She didn't want to confront them directly. She had no idea if they were armed or if they might react violently if caught in the act. But she also knew that allowing them to work uninterrupted would mean starting the exhausting cycle all over again. She picked up her phone and called the non-emergency police line, explaining in a low voice that strangers were on her property in the middle of the night unloading unknown materials. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol car, but warned it might take several minutes given the unit's current location. Lydia hung up and stood in the dark, listening. The sound of the sacks hitting asphalt was soft but steady, punctuated by occasional murmurs between the men, too low to make out words, but their tone was unhurried, almost casual. The sweep of headlights across the far wall of her living room announced the arrival of the patrol car sooner than she expected. The intruders reacted instantly, abandoning the last sack and jogging toward the truck. By the time the officers stepped out, the vehicle was already pulling away, disappearing down the road without so much as a license plate glance from Lydia's vantage point. One officer walked the length of the driveway with a flashlight, illuminating dozens of newly scattered marbles, while the other took Lydia's statement. She gave a precise account of what she had seen, emphasizing the presence of the truck and the timing of the noise. The officer nodded but offered little in the way of reassurance, saying only that they would increase patrol presence in the area. By morning, Lydia's resolve had hardened. She contacted a small law office in town, explaining that she needed advice regarding repeated trespassing and harassment on her property. The attorney she spoke with, a woman named Sarah Vernon, listened carefully before suggesting they begin by documenting every instance in detail and sending a formal cease and desist letter to any known individuals who might be responsible. Lydia admitted that while she had strong suspicions about her neighbor Karen's involvement, she had no direct evidence tying her to the intrusions. Sarah's voice was measured when she replied, "Then our goal is to either get that evidence or make the activity too risky to continue without it, becoming obvious who's behind it." Later that afternoon, Lydia received a surprise visit from a man, wearing a reflective vest and carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself as a site inspector from a construction firm she didn't recognize, claiming he was there to assess her driveway for upcoming works. Lydia, recalling the road authority's confirmation that no such works were planned, asked to see his credentials and the permit authorizing the inspection. The man's smile faltered slightly as he fumbled through his clipboard before muttering that he must have the wrong address. She watched from the porch as he walked briskly back to his truck and drove off, noting the company name stenciled on the door. She immediately wrote it down to give to Sarah. That evening, Sarah called with preliminary findings. The construction company was indeed legitimate, but they had no record of sending anyone to Lydia's address. More troubling was the fact that the company's name had appeared on recent filings for property improvements within the neighborhood, often coinciding with parcels that had changed hands under urgent sale conditions. Lydia didn't miss the implication. These marbles, the glass, the uninvited inspection, they could all be part of a coordinated effort to make her property appear neglected, hazardous, or otherwise ripe for takeover. Wanting another layer of protection, Lydia arranged for 2 floodlights to be installed along the driveway, their motion sensors calibrated to pick up even the smallest movement. She also purchased a discreet trail camera, placing it high in the branches of a spruce tree where it had an unobstructed view of the road's bend. She was realistic about what these measures could achieve. They wouldn't stop someone determined, but they might change the balance between risk and reward for whoever was orchestrating the harassment. The following morning, when she stepped outside to collect the mail, she found an unmarked envelope wedged between the regular letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "This isn't over," typed in a large, bold font. There was no return address, no identifying marks, nothing to indicate its sender except the obvious conclusion. She placed the letter into the growing file she kept in her workshop, alongside the photographs, the printed text message, and her written log. She made a copy for Sarah and dropped it off at the law office later that day. It was during that visit that Sarah proposed a more proactive step, reaching out to a local land surveyor to recertify the property boundaries. If they're planning to dispute your ownership, the best defense is current, indisputable proof, she explained. Lydia agreed, and by the end of the week, the surveyor had not only confirmed her boundaries but also identified that the paint marks extended 3 feet inside her property line, a deliberate encroachment that would be hard to explain away as an accident. When Sarah saw the report, her expression was grim. "This gives us leverage," she said. "It's physical evidence of tampering. The next time they try something, we'll be in a position to escalate legally." For the first time in days, Lydia felt a flicker of control return. The harassment hadn't stopped, but now she was no longer reacting blindly. She had allies, documentation, and a growing sense of the shape of the threat she was facing. And though she didn't yet know when or how the next move would come, she knew she was ready to meet it head-on. The uneasy quiet that had settled over Lydia's property after the surveyor's visit lasted less than a week before it broke in a way that was both blatant and unnervingly calculated. It began on a breezy Thursday morning when she went out to drive into town and found her driveway blocked by a stack of long, narrow wooden crates laid diagonally across the asphalt just beyond the bend near the road. At first glance, they could have been mistaken for construction materials. Fresh pine planks bolted into sturdy frames, but the way they were positioned made it impossible for her car to pass without stopping to move them, and their sheer weight suggested they had been placed there to make moving them alone a serious challenge. Lydia stood with her hands on her hips, scanning the tree line for movement, but the neighborhood was still, the kind of stillness that felt watched. She considered calling the police immediately, but part of her wanted to see if whoever had left them would make an appearance when she tried to clear the obstruction. She fetched a crowbar from the garage and began prying at the lids, curiosity and suspicion prickling at her skin. The first crate was empty, but the second contained a haphazard spill of marbles mixed with fine, jagged gravel, exactly the same combination she had found on her driveway before. The sight made her pulse jump, and she stepped back, realizing the crates themselves were as much a message as their contents, a reminder that the harassment could resume at full force at any moment. Before she could decide on her next step, the sound of an engine approached, and she saw a familiar SUV slow as it came around the curve in the road. It was Karen, her window rolled down and her sunglasses reflecting the morning light. "Looks like you've been getting deliveries again," she called, her tone falsely sympathetic, as if this were an unfortunate coincidence rather than an act in which she took pleasure. Lydia said nothing, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of a reaction, but Karen continued, "You really should consider that maybe all this trouble is a sign. Some properties just aren't worth the headache." She drove off before Lydia could respond, leaving the faint scent of gasoline and something bitter hanging in the air. Frustration sharpened into determination, and Lydia dialed Sarah's number. The attorney listened carefully before advising her to document the crates in place before moving them and to keep any contents as evidence. Lydia photographed each crate from multiple angles, noting the placement on the driveway and the distinct tire tracks leading from the road to their current position. With the help of a neighbor she trusted, a quiet, no-nonsense man named Tom who lived at the far end of the street, she managed to shift the crates to the side so her car could pass. Tom didn't ask many questions, but his expression tightened when he saw the marbles inside. "This is deliberate," he said simply, and promised to keep an eye out for any unusual activity near her property. That afternoon, Lydia made a trip into town not just for errands but to file a formal trespassing complaint at the police station. She handed over printed photographs of the crates, the surveyor's report showing the paint markings inside her property line, and the anonymous threatening note. The officer on duty took the file with a professional nod, assuring her that the department would add her address to its patrol list and that the incidents would be logged for future reference. It wasn't the decisive intervention she had hoped for, but it was another official record, another piece of her defense. 2 nights later, the next wave of escalation arrived. Just after midnight, the floodlights along her driveway flared to life, triggered by movement near the bend. Lydia, half asleep, felt the sudden brightness spill across her bedroom wall and got up to look. She could make out the silhouette of a person crouched low, moving along the edge of the asphalt as if inspecting it. By the time she slipped on her robe and stepped onto the porch, the figure was retreating into the shadows toward a dark vehicle idling by the road. She caught the glint of something metallic in their hand before they disappeared, possibly a spray can or marking tool. The next morning confirmed her suspicion. A fresh series of bright orange lines had been painted across the driveway, intersecting in a crude grid that looked like preliminary demolition markings. The audacity of painting over private property, especially after the boundary confirmation, made her hands clench into fists. She took more photographs, emailed them to Sarah, and then, without hesitation, called the police again to update her complaint. The responding officer walked the driveway with her, noting the paint and the tracks from the previous night. "This isn't standard marking," he remarked, and whoever did it knew exactly where to put it to cause trouble. Sarah's reply later that day was even more telling. She had cross-checked the company name Lydia had written down from the earlier inspector visit with recent permit applications in the area, and a new application had appeared just 2 days prior, a request to extend a shared access road that, if approved, would cut directly through the upper portion of Lydia's driveway. The application listed a developer's name Lydia didn't recognize but used an address in the same office building where Karen's husband ran a consulting firm. The web of connections was tightening, and the picture it formed was becoming harder to ignore. That evening, as the sun slipped below the trees, Lydia made a decision. She placed 2 heavy concrete barriers at the base of her driveway, leaving just enough space for her own car to pass but no clearance for larger vehicles. It was a physical statement that she would not allow uninvited access, and she felt a small surge of relief when the barriers stood solid against the cooling night air. But she also knew that such an open act of defiance would provoke a response. Whether that response came in the form of another delivery, a legal maneuver, or something more underhanded, she could not predict. What she did know was that she was past the point of simply hoping it would stop. The game had shifted, and if they wanted to fight over her right to her own property, she was ready to meet them step for step. The confrontation Lydia had anticipated came sooner than she expected, and it arrived with the kind of open hostility that left no room for misinterpretation. 3 days after she placed the concrete barriers at the base of her driveway, she woke to the sound of raised voices outside, sharp and insistent enough to carry through the walls of her home. Milo was already at the front door, barking with a low, steady intensity that told her this wasn't a casual passerby. Pulling on a sweater, she stepped onto the porch and saw Karen standing just beyond the barriers, flanked by 2 men in reflective safety vests. One of them was holding a clipboard, the other a measuring tape, as if they were preparing to begin work on the spot. Karen's expression was an unmasked mixture of irritation and triumph, her voice loud enough for any nearby neighbor to hear. "You can't block a public access point," Karen declared, pointing at the barriers with a manicured finger. These gentlemen are here on behalf of the Development Committee to assess the road improvements, and you're interfering with an approved project." Her words were carefully chosen, carrying the tone of someone who had practiced them, but Lydia had been preparing her own response for weeks. She walked calmly down the driveway, stopping just short of the barriers, her phone already in her hand and recording. "This is not a public access point," Lydia said evenly. "This is my private driveway, confirmed by a certified surveyor, and any project that involves altering it without my consent is unlawful." She glanced at the men, noting their hesitation. "If you have a court order or a legal easement, show it now. Otherwise, you're trespassing." The man with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably and muttered that they'd been told the area was part of a shared right-of-way. Lydia produced a copy of the surveyor's report from a folder she had brought with her, holding it out for them to see. "This document says otherwise, and if you choose to ignore it, I'll be adding your names to a formal complaint for criminal trespass." The tension hung for a moment before the man with the measuring tape quietly suggested they verify the paperwork before proceeding. Karen's face flushed, but she tried to mask it with a condescending smile. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice low enough now that only Lydia could hear. "There are easier ways to handle this than digging in your heels." Lydia didn't flinch. "I'm sure there are," she replied, "but I'm not in the business of giving away my property." The two men retreated toward their truck, murmuring to each other, and Karen lingered just long enough to deliver one last, thinly veiled warning. "You think you've won something here, but you're just delaying the inevitable." She walked off without waiting for a reply, and Lydia watched her go, the weight of the moment settling in. This had been the first time they had tried to push the situation in broad daylight in front of potential witnesses, and it had ended with them backing down. That meant her preparation, her documents, her barriers, her refusal to be intimidated, was working, but it also meant they would now be looking for another angle, something more aggressive or less visible. Later that afternoon, Sarah called to say she had sent a cease and desist letter to Karen and to the developer named on the road extension permit, citing the surveyor's report and the repeated trespass incidents. It was a strong move, one that put the burden on them to either produce legal justification or abandon their claim. Sarah also suggested Lydia file for a restraining order if the harassment continued, a thought Lydia hadn't fully considered until now but found herself increasingly open to. As evening fell, Lydia walked the length of her driveway, her eyes tracing the edges where the paint marks had been scrubbed away and the asphalt now lay in quiet shadow. For the first time in weeks, she felt the balance shift slightly in her favor. Not enough to relax, but enough to recognize that she wasn't just reacting anymore, she was setting the terms. She didn't know if the next move would come as a legal document, another midnight delivery, or something more brazen, but she knew she had taken the fight into the open, and that alone was a victory worth holding on to. The battle for her driveway was no longer a game of intimidation. It was a test of who would stand their ground the longest, and Lydia had no intention of being the one to break first. In the weeks that followed the standoff at the driveway, the tension in the neighborhood didn't vanish overnight, but it began to shift in a way Lydia could feel with each quiet morning she stepped outside. The cease and desist letters Sarah had sent had a chilling effect on the more visible acts of harassment. No more marbles, no more glass shards, no more mysterious crates or nighttime intrusions. The bright orange paint marks faded under rain and wind, and though she still caught the occasional lingering glance from Karen when their paths crossed, the overt aggression had ebbed into something more distant and resentful. The road extension permit quietly expired without renewal, and the construction company, whose name had been tied to the supposed inspections, removed it from their public project listings, citing unresolved property disputes. Lydia left the concrete barriers in place, not out of fear but as a symbol of resolve, and she took quiet satisfaction each time she drove past them. The trail camera remained hidden in the spruce tree, a silent witness she hoped would never again need to record anything of consequence. Milo resumed his lazy patrols of the yard, his limp fully healed, and the hum of tension that had taken root in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by the normal rhythms of the coastal town she had once imagined when she first moved here. It wasn't a perfect ending. Trust with some neighbors had been frayed, and she knew Karen's grudge hadn't dissolved so much as gone underground. But it was enough. She had defended her home without being pushed into reckless decisions, had gathered proof when it mattered, and had forced those who wanted to pressure her into stepping back on her terms. The driveway, once a battleground, was simply a driveway again, its smooth black surface catching the late afternoon light in the same way it had on the very first day she saw it. Standing at the top of it one cool evening, coffee in hand, Lydia let herself breathe in the salty air and the scent of pine. She knew the world didn't grant permanent victories, that vigilance was still a necessity, but she also knew that whatever came next, she had proven she could stand her ground and keep what was hers. For now, that was enough.